Awesome. So hi, everyone. My name is Choucair. I work at the Quantum Insider, which is one of the businesses under Resonance. So a lot of you may have heard of the Quantum Insider if you're following quantum technology. We are known for providing the news. In fact, I've had a lot of people come up to our booth today and ask if we are that magazine that they seem to have seen online or on LinkedIn. And we do track news and media across the quantum domain, but we also do something else. And so something that's very central to a lot of the work that we do is our data platform. And so at the Quantum Insider, we actually track funding across the industry of quantum. So this includes government funding as well as investment into industry. We track patents, research, use cases. We track enterprise users and all the different entities who are building quantum hardware and software. And this part I really wanted to call out because it's actually very integral to what we're going to talk about here today, because it's this focus that we have on providing not just the news, but also tracking every facet of the industry through the data, analyzing the trends, and also being on the ground often in these different regions, meeting with people. It's all these three pieces that are really powerful because it's this that allows us to work very closely with industries and with regions on building quantum ecosystems. And we're going to talk a lot about quantum ecosystems. And so before we get into that, now I know a lot of you here, if you're here at Q2B, you're probably interested in quantum, you're invested in quantum. And so I really wanted to take some time to look at why we're so interested in building quantum ecosystems. And a lot of you are already very interested. But for us, we're really looking at the bigger picture. We're not just wanting to advance the hardware, the software, build the workforce, but we really want to look at every single piece of the industry, and we want to work closely with entities to show them how they can not just have a hardware provider, but rather have an entire system that promotes the advancement of the technology itself. So we recently had a market sizing report. Very conscious so you can hear this. Is it my hair? Thank you. So we had our recent market sizing report, which came out a couple months ago, where we did a really deep dive analysis of what the market looked like today, what it's looked like in the past, and what we think it will look like roughly 10 years into the future. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of value. So if we look at this year alone, for instance, the first few days of September of this year, there was over 1 billion that was invested into quantum technologies. Now this is really significant because that actually exceeds the total amount of funding invested into quantum in the year of 2020. So we're really starting to see this acceleration. This really shows us that investors are investing in companies that are actively developing applications in optimization and security and simulation. So where quantum used to be more of this fringe technology, it's starting to follow this track that we see for other emerging technologies, which is this really slow build, gets to a tipping point, and then accelerates quite quickly. And we also did a bit of an analysis into the markets that stood to capture the most value. And so this is really interesting because if we look at these first few segments here, and we look at the total market size, if we look at financial services, for instance, this is a $14 trillion market. Now, of course, quantum is not going to capture $14 trillion in value, but what it can capture is roughly 400 to 600 billion. That's a lot of money. And so I also wanted to kind of pause here because I recognize these are very large numbers. And the full report is available on our website with our process for analysis. But I know a lot of you in this room who have been involved in quantum technology have heard this talk of really extreme numbers over a 10-year timeline. We've talked about 10 years quite often for the past probably 10 years. But what we are starting to see, because we track all of these signals and all of these trends, we did this very conservatively. And it's very clear that there's this acceleration in not just the development of use cases, but also in the potential for impact. Like this really is becoming something that's more plausible than it was. And also, I wanted to do a quick look at enterprises. So we don't just track the quantum companies building the applications, but these are companies that are not, these are not quantum companies. These are not quantum hardware, quantum software. These are large enterprises that are actively building teams in quantum research and development. They're actively putting out publications on a consistent basis, and they're working on ways that they can have quantum applications worked into their internal workflows. So in 2022, we tracked roughly 220 enterprises that were adopting quantum technologies. As of this year, when this market report was done back in July, that number had exceeded 500. And if we look at regions, these are a few of the regions that we've actually worked with at the Quantum Insider. So these are in the States. We did Massachusetts, South Carolina, North Carolina, and recently New Mexico. These are regions that are actively reaching out. They're commissioning our studies and white papers to understand what is the potential economic value that quantum can have in their region. How do they go about looking at their strengths, looking at the infrastructure that they have in place in order to capture that value, and how do they get started? This isn't isolated to those states. If we look here, some of you guys have probably seen a lot about these states right here. So Chicago has invested nearly $20 billion to build a quantum computing campus. Colorado's governor has committed $74 billion to unlock quantum value. And Montana, the US Air Force Research Laboratory recently invested around $45 million into the Montana State University. And New Mexico has committed over $300 million to quantum. So these are very significant. I actually just returned from the Texas Quantum Summit in the state. They recently passed a bill to have their Texas Quantum Initiative. And while I was there was a panel with a House of Representatives on the panel, Greg Bonin, and he did mention that while they haven't allocated funding to the initiative, there's roughly 700 to 800 million per year allocated to sectors like defense, energy, and space, where they see quantum being able to capture a large part of that value as well. Yes, please. And this is not isolated to just the states. I have some more states listed here, but let's move on. But this is also present across the rest of the world. So we see that many countries are starting to put out national quantum strategies, and they're also actively reaching out to commission studies to understand how can they build on their existing infrastructure and how can they leverage their strengths. And so I really wanted to put this full picture together so that we could talk a bit about what we've seen from all this work working with states, working with nations. What are the trends we can start to extrapolate to understand how does a region go about building a quantum ecosystem? And so I don't want to generalize too much, but there's roughly three strategies that we like to present, or rather analyze, whenever we go into one of these projects. And the first is, how do we leverage existing strengths in infrastructure? And so as an example, I wanted to take a look at the difference between Europe, the European Union rather, and the United States, and how they've approached quantum security. And now I also want to call out both regions have interest in both PQC and QKD, but there is a bit of a difference between how the two have gone about it. So for instance, if we look at the US, what the US really reflects is this vetted interest in PQC, which makes sense, because we have this really long invested effort into software, into cloud deployment, into standards. And so we see these larger entities like Google, AWS, and other ones actively committing to PQC integration. But we also see that the NIST invested 8 years of research and development of calling on this PQC competition so that we could put out these algorithms for PQC. So this makes sense because this is building off of existing expertise, existing strengths, and where we have exceeded in the past. And the same thing is true if we look at Europe. So EuroQCI recently has invested, or over the course of many years, has invested roughly 90 million euros into QKD, to this focus on QKD. And this makes sense because Europe has this very deep telecom expertise. And so again, this is how do we look at these cultural strengths and these regional strengths and start building there. And again, I don't want to make any sort of, I'm not saying one is better than the other, we need PQC and QKD, but this is where we can see these regions start to differentiate. So this first core principle that I really want to make clear is that building on existing strengths is very, very critical. And so now let's look at constraints. And so this is kind of the antithesis of the first one. So with any region or state, there's usually some sort of challenge or weakness that comes to mind. And two that I want to actively look at are Malta and Montana. Very different, but they do have something in common. So Malta is a very, very small island, very, very small. In fact, if we look at Malta quite closely, there is an ambassador to Malta who works in the government. He's also a professor of physics at the local university, and he's also the CEO of the first quantum security company in Malta. So if you go to Malta, there are many people who are wearing multiple hats because it is a small country. However, this actually has worked very, very well in terms of building a quantum ecosystem. Because one, you have these active lines of communication between these three very integral pillars, so industry, government, and academia. It's not difficult for them to get a hold of each other. We did a webinar with them recently, and they said it was very, very easy for them to call up one another, email one another, get a hold of one another, pass each other on the streets. So it's very, very easy to have those conversations. But even more so, they were able to do the pilot of the first cross-country QKD link, and this is easier because it was a smaller country. But this shows how the small size of Malta, which appears as a challenge and can be a challenge, also made them incredibly agile, also made them able to collaborate very, very deeply easier. And so this is very, very important. The second thing I want to look at is Montana. So I don't know how many of you have been to Montana, but it's a very beautiful state, very big state. Now, what they needed was they recognized that they were lacking the mature labs, the major labs that other states have. They also did not have a large PhD pool to pull from for the quantum workforce. And this is not isolated to Montana. I know a lot of us feel this across the globe. But what they wanted to do here was really build up their workforce. And by doing so, they really wanted to invest in training more at the technician level. So how can you get people who are able to they have this really natural, photonics-based ecosystem. And so it made more sense to leverage technician and those people who are engineering, but rather than trying to invest in maybe more of the PhD programs. And this is really great because now there's a very large ecosystem in Montana and a workforce that can actively contribute to the development of quantum hardware. So constraints can actually be accelerators for strategy if used in the right way. And the last piece I want to touch on is the incredible importance of partnership. And I really, really want to emphasize, and I kind of mentioned this on the previous slide, that governments, industry, and academia have to work together in order to build a quantum ecosystem. This is essential. And so what we've noticed is that when you find regions that are able to bring together, one, to help policymakers understand why quantum is necessary to invest in and what sorts of economic value it can create, while also building in programs to develop workforce and education. And this doesn't necessarily need to be universities. This could also look like micro-credentials. This could also look like internships and hands-on training. There also needs to be some pretty direct lines for capital and investment. And we also need the private infrastructure as well. So in order to build a quantum ecosystem, this last part is really the essentialness of coherence. To have a really terrible pun at the end of my slides. Now, what's really great and why this really feeds into everything that we do is we saw this through the work that we did, that it's great to track the research. It's great to track the funding. But what really is meaningful is when you put it all together in one platform, when you put it all together in one picture, It's really all these pieces side by side and the connective tissue that brings them together that shows you how the ecosystem is accelerating. So it allows us to see the trends over time, but it also shows you how you can build one on a regional basis. And so if you're interested more in our data, there is a QR code over there. I hope it still works. And yeah. So these are some of our clients and the organizations that we've worked with. We've worked very, very closely to help these partners and others understand where they can partner and how we can all collaborate in order to build this, develop the technology, and move it forward. Yeah. I believe that's the end of my slides. Thank you.
Hello. Any questions for Cierra?
Sorry.
Hi, great talk. I'm wondering what you think the biggest bottlenecks or hurdles are for developing a successful quantum ecosystem between the US, the EU, and China. So what are the biggest bottlenecks for each of these places?
For each of these separately or together?
Separately.
Separately. Okay. Let me think about this. Oh, yeah. Don't want that. I would say China would be very, very difficult to say because there's not a lot of transparency. We personally also don't get a lot of visibility into how, especially from the government perspective, we don't have a lot of transparency into how China is approaching this from a policy level. We do see a lot of researcher papers come out of China, and we also know that there's a decent amount of funding. And we've seen some updates, some sparse updates about their QPU that they have that's, name escapes me right now. But that one would be very, very difficult to say. I guess, however, that being said, that the lack of ability to partner quite extensively across the rest of the globe would be a bit of a bottleneck. Especially if we look at the supply chain. So on one of the recent trips we did to South Korea, they were really looking at how do they build this very domestic supply chain so they can manufacture everything ground up in South Korea and then also keep their workforce there, keep their startups there. But it didn't work very well, right? And so what we really wanted to emphasize is this incredible need to partnership because yes, you could create everything bottom up in your own region. But it's also better to kind of there's people who do it best elsewhere. And so using the best hardware from the best providers, especially when we think about quantum hardware, which is incredibly sensitive and needs to be done with precision. So I would say for China, probably a bottleneck would be the lack of ability to partner extensively. For the European Union, that's tough. That's really tough. Yeah. I have heard some things as I've been here and I've been having conversations, and something that's come up again and again is this need to really invest in the private sector and to have very clear funding lines of funding for private industry, and this is lacking. And this is difficult too, because if we think about the trajectory of quantum technology, quantum startups don't necessarily benefit from the model that venture capital offers, which they want these very quick returns over 2 to 3 years. And I consider it fairly unlikely that most startups will have that very quick return over 2 to 3 years. We really want to see these companies invested in for 10 plus years. And so this is a very long, long journey. And so they struggle with a lack of clear lines to funding. In the US, it's also a really great question. I'm going to say, so we partner. There's a lot of partnerships in the US. Again, I think we would also struggle with the clear lines to funding. So I did mention Texas, and I mentioned how the House rep was talking about the 700 to 800 million. So the issue right now is they have this Texas Quantum Initiative, and they've talked about how there will be funding, but they've yet to commit any amount of money. And so the recommendation from the policymaker was rather, why don't you tap into funding that's already allocated elsewhere? And if you look at states where they have these domains, such as energy and space in Texas, these can align with quantum technology quite well. So I think it's fair to say we could potentially tap in there and get some use cases aligned with industry there. But there are states where this might not be as true. And so I hope that answers your question. Oops.